All right, hello everybody, and welcome to Weaponization, War, or a Deal, President Trump's high-stakes approach toward Iran. I am Ryan Costello, Policy Director with the National Iranian American Council, which is hosting this event. And NIAC was founded in 2002 and has long been a leading voice in Washington, D.C. for the Iranian American community on matters of war and peace and civil rights here in the United States. Many thanks to Senator Chris Van Hollen and his staff for securing this room and all of you for joining us here today. We have an expert panel here to focus on U.S.-Iran relations under the second Trump administration, including Curt Mills, to my left, a seasoned journalist specializing in foreign policy and political campaign coverage. He currently serves as the executive director of the American Conservative, where he previously held positions as senior reporter and contributing editor. Throughout his career, Mills has contributed to several notable publications, including National Interest, U.S. News and World Report, Washington Examiner, and The Spectator, and earlier this year, he joined the Tucker Carlson show to break down the Trump administration's approach to various foreign policy issues. We also have Negar Mortazavi, an Iranian-American journalist and political analyst, known for her insightful coverage of Iranian affairs and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. She is the editor and host of the Iran podcast, which you should all give a listen to, and she serves as the senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C. And last, we have Jamal Abdi, president of the National Iranian American Council since 2018, as well as the executive director of NIAC Action, NIAC's sister advocacy organization. So let's jump into it. Curt, we can start with you. President Trump has entered office. He's had a couple of months. Iran has received a lot of attention, and I think it's pretty clear that he's emphasized diplomacy and getting a verified nuclear peace agreement with Iran. But perhaps what we're seeing is also some dueling camps within the Trump administration. We have, on the one hand, National Security Advisor Michael Waltz staking out that the policy is full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program, which contrasts a bit with the tone set by Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, who focused instead on verification of Iran's nuclear program. So, what is the Trump administration approach toward Iran, as best we can tell? And, if there are these dueling camps, which one of them does it seem best reflects President Trump's approach?
Yeah, so thank you for having me very much. I mean, of course, as everybody remembers, this is not the first Trump administration. So in the first administration, a lot of the political capital and focus that the Iran portfolio got from President Trump was to leave the Obama-era JCPOA. I think there's a variety of reasons why he did that. At the time when he left, he had installed John Bolton as National Security Advisor and replaced Rex Tillerson with Mike Pompeo. Their predecessors, H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson, while definitely hawkish and conservative, weren't as committed to leaving the framework. So when he made the swap in his personnel, they left that April or May of 18, so 7 years ago. I think it's pretty clear that Trump left principally because of animus with President Obama and his level of investment in the policy details of the Iran hawk cause. He's not a subscriber or has thought deeply about the issue. I think is the balance of the evidence. Of course, though, that team that shepherded that maneuver continued to lead Trump's national security through 2019. Bolton left in September and was replaced by Robert C. O'Brien, who is a more careful version, but still, definitely an Iran hawk. And, obviously tensions with Iran reached crescendo in January of 2020 with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Unclear if that would have continued in 2020 if it hadn't been for COVID. Obviously, COVID was terrible, but one of the few advantages of it is that it put most geopolitical tensions on ice, right? Probably delayed the Ukraine war and probably delayed any action by the Republicans on Iran. Fast forward, I think a number of things have changed. Number one, Trump is way more obsessive about his personnel agreeing with him. That's a noted change. I think that was coming if he had been reelected in 2020 anyways, but with 4 years in exile to think about it, he's obviously put way more of a stamp and made a point of it. Number two, there's considerable evidence that his relationship with Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, then and now, has disintegrated. I think it's not quite at Zelensky level. I think there are considerably more interests in this country that want to preserve the Israeli relationship as it is than there are on Ukraine, although not an inconsiderable number of those too. But I think, and also Netanyahu's, I think, frankly, more clever than Zelensky with managing the Trump relationship. But I think those two things, that Trump very much wants a personnel staff that agrees with him, and that the relationship with Netanyahu has near collapsed, has changed his framework. So since he's gotten in, but really since the 24 campaign, he's made it very, very, very clear he wants a deal. Now, into that void, I think, as Ryan was kind of getting at, two sort of groups have emerged. The first group is perhaps greater or more substantially represented among Trump's outside advisors and Trump's friends. So Steve Witkoff, who is in the government, but sort of has a rotating special envoy role, arguably on some days more important than the Secretary of State, much to the consternation of Marco Rubio, Trump's longtime friend, probably green for this job, but he has looked at basically the two main wars, the Ukraine war and the Middle East war, and said, why can't we get a deal? It seems as if some of the parties are being unfair, and of course that's caused a storm, particularly in the Israeli press, but also in the Ukrainian press. In tandem with Mr. Witkoff is probably Tucker Carlson, who I sat down with in January and have known for a number of years. Of course, Carlson was absolutely critical in talking Trump off the ledge in January 2020 to avoid greater escalation with the Iranians after the Soleimani operation. He is more aggressive than ever in urging against a war on Iran. Within Trump's ranks themselves, I think it's very clear that his national security advisor, for as long as he lasts in the job, Mr. Waltz, is very much pushing, as he said openly on the Sunday press shows, for complete dismantlement of the Iranian nuclear program, which is essentially a non-starter so far as I could tell for any Iranian administration, moderate or hardliner, and is basically an attempt to poison pill the deal. The other thing that there has been reporting, or I should say vibrations on, is whether or not some of the administration are touting the, quote, Libya model, which of course is what Muammar Gaddafi did after the U.S. sacked Saddam. The Libyans basically unilaterally disarmed. They're saying why the Iranians can't do that. Obviously, I think if you're sitting in Tehran, you're in the government, it's not particularly attractive to follow the Gaddafi model. So, yeah, I think there's essentially two camps, those who want a deal. That deal would, I don't think, be interchangeable with the Obama-era JCPOA. I think that's a talking point of the hawks, which is like, you can't do this because this is what Obama did. I think it will be a different version, but it would be a pragmatic working agreement that Trump could come to table with. But I think on the other side of the ledger, traditional neoconservative hawks within the administration, such as Michael Waltz, as well as complaints, public and private, from the Israeli authorities.
And with the Libya model, we also saw, that was a specific turn of phrase that John Bolton used in the North Korea negotiations that got him into trouble with President Trump when he got fired. There was a citation of, Libya model, turning off the North Koreans from talks. So, Negar, on the hawkish rhetoric that Trump has been using in recent days, he said over the weekend that if there's not a deal, there will be bombing, something along the lines of the likes that Iran has never seen before. Perhaps this is, taking a page from that fire and fury rhetoric and, kind of the ratcheting up the pressure approach to deal making. But how does this play inside of Iran? And, what is, the impact of this rhetoric on the ground that we can tell?
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation and to all of you for attending this event. Um, so honestly, I mean, nobody knows how serious the threat is. It's very hard for me to predict. What we've seen on the first Trump term is that eventually the threats could materialize. And we saw that the two countries went to the brink of war in January 2020 after the assassination of the Iranian top general Qasem Soleimani back then, which I think was a very dangerous move. Now, however, that materialized, what kind of advice led to that. And then the Iranians responded, if you all remember, by attacking directly the U.S. airbase in Iraq for the first time from Iranian soil, attacking a U.S. base with missiles, announcing it publicly, taking responsibility for it. Essentially, I think designed as sort of a warning shot, but also a dangerous one. It could have potentially a lot of casualties and escalate that episode to much worse than what we saw. But eventually that sort of wrapped up and they took an off-ramp from that path to war. But I think the danger of a situation like that, which I wouldn't completely rule out and is a possibility, is you can't always control these kind of escalations. And once you enter or open that door, it's hard to, first of all, predict or calculate the outcomes of these kind of attacks, and also the reaction of the other side and how far you can escalate. As far as Tehran's view on taking the threat seriously, I think they are. The rhetoric seems that they are taking the threat seriously, but maybe not in the way that the president here intends. I think the way his whole strategy is designed, and in the first term, I would even argue, is to ratchet up the pressure to get to diplomacy, so peace through strength, or sort of force them to come to the negotiating table, which didn't happen in the first term. And I honestly am not sure if it's going to happen this time. And for some parties that may happen in private deals or in international affairs. For example, that model worked with North Korea. The harsh rhetoric, the escalation in rhetoric eventually did lead to diplomacy for President Trump in the first term. But with Iran, it didn't. And I don't think this is going to work. And the Iranians seem to be sort of pushing the same position that they did last time. They even coined a term for it, maximum resistance, that in the face of maximum pressure, what they pursued as their policy was maximum resistance. And this time around, they are doing the same thing. So eventually, yes, taking the threats seriously, but not in the way that we assume to prevent a potential attack and therefore rushing to the negotiating table. One thing I see as a slight change in rhetoric and tone from Tehran coming is their emphasis on indirect talks. So in the first term and also in the past few weeks, or at least a couple of months, it feels like it's been a long time, but it hasn't. I think the rhetoric and also the policy was that we will not negotiate under pressure, we will not negotiate under threats, but now they've added a caveat and are really highlighting that. We heard the foreign minister said that, and apparently it's also in the letter that the Iran sent back. So the Iranians, interestingly, President Trump chose to have a UAE envoy, a senior UAE diplomat, deliver the letter to Tehran, which took a long time, and the Iranians chose to send it back through their trusted partner, which is Oman. The Omanis have had a history of mediation between Tehran and Washington. That also, I think, there are interesting signals in those choices. And now the president is set to travel to the Gulf. Iran-Saudi relations are different this time around. We can talk about that more. But what I wanted to emphasize is their highlighting of their openness to indirect talks. Basically, they're saying we're not negotiating under pressure and threat directly, but we will negotiate indirectly. Now, what does that exactly mean? Does that mean with someone like Steve Witkoff, for example, in a different room at the same hotel, which is what they did, the indirect negotiations under the Biden administration. I think I see a little opening there. But again, to your question, the threats, I think, are being taken seriously in Tehran, but seriously as in preparing for a potential threat. And if diplomacy doesn't happen, I think that's the trajectory that they'll be going down. And it's very dangerous. I mean, U.S.-Iran conflict is not going to benefit anyone in the region.
Definitely agree there. So, Jamal, let's say negotiations break down and we do get to the stage where there is war, perhaps a U.S.-Israeli joint military operation against Iran's nuclear program. We had Senator Tom Cotton yesterday during a nomination hearing, basically decry, hey, there's all this hysteria around an Iran war and that there will be a forever war, using air quotes. What would a bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear program look like? Would it wipe out the Iranian nuclear threat, or would it basically encourage a doubling down?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. Maybe Tom Cotton doesn't. I think starting a war with Iran probably is worth debating the downsides before going into that. And actually, yesterday at a hearing on the House side, we actually had 3 witnesses who said that Congress should begin planning to authorize military force against Iran. Sort of this open-ended pre-approval by Congress for action that nobody has explained. How does this end? What is the end goal of a bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear facilities? Even the most bullish advocates for military action acknowledge that you can't destroy the entire program. It's dispersed, it's buried deep, very hard to, it's not just a one-off bombing campaign, it is a sustained campaign. And even after that campaign is over, first of all, think about what Iran does, whether it is responding militarily, whether it is finally kicking out inspectors for good and truly working towards a nuclear weapon, other methods of retaliation. Everybody acknowledges then we would need to go in again and again and again. And it was one of the former Joint Chiefs of Staff who explained, if we actually want to remove Iran's nuclear program militarily, this will require boots on the ground and an occupation that will be measured in decades. So anybody who's talking about pre-authorizing military action, without asking that question, how does this end? It begs the question, okay, so what are we signing up for? Are we signing up for this sustained mowing the lawn strategy where we're constantly bombing Iran and hoping that is constrained to the borders of Iran and doesn't become a total conflagration across the region? I think, if you look at some of the advocates for the bombing, if you press them beyond the initial just how tough and how gratifying it's going to be, they'll acknowledge, well, the idea here is actually to bomb them until the regime is toppled. Okay, at least let's be honest about that then. So this is a US-led regime change war. I mean, I think we can look at the history of how those work out and how much of an investment that would entail. If that's what we are signing up for, if that's what Congress is expected to pre-authorize, and pre-authorize along the same lines as what Congress did in 2002, authorizing war with Iraq, not because we were going to go invade Iraq, but because George W. Bush needed a unified body politic in the U.S. to go to the UN to press for a UN resolution, and then lo and behold, he didn't get the resolution, and we invaded, and here we are 20 years later. So I really think that there is a lot of loose talk of war, and I think that we should all be very honest about how does this end? Are we actually talking about a prolonged US-led regime change operation? Is this going to involve troops on the ground? And at the end of the day, is this the way that Iran finally builds a nuclear weapon? Is this how we provoke Khamenei to finally say, okay, I'm lifting the seal, we are going towards a nuclear weapon? Because that is what most experts are saying is what could trigger that decision to finally be made.
And just to piggyback off that last point there, so we had the Director of National Intelligence brief on worldwide threats last week, and the assessment on Iran's nuclear program was Khamenei stopped the nuclear weapons program in 2003 and hasn't authorized restarting it, essentially. So they're not actively going for a nuclear weapon. They've very much advanced their nuclear program, ramping up 60% enriched uranium accumulation to the extent where if they decided to, turn the centrifuges faster, ramp that up to weapons grade, they could have enough for 6 nuclear weapons. But they are not making that decision right now. What an Iranian advisor to the Supreme Leader said just this past weekend, Larijani, is that if Iran's nuclear program is bombed, we would be forced to weaponize our nuclear program. And I think that's the most explicit any Iranian figure has been about them changing their nuclear doctrine from some sort of hedging strategy to outright pursuit of a nuclear weapon. And I think that's very dangerous. So, Curt, Trump wants an American first foreign policy, right? So what's the case for why a deal would put America first as opposed to this bombing campaign?
Sure. I mean, I would say it's pretty self-evident. I think Trump one has to remember, not that Republican, right? He's changed parties a number of times. The ideas that he was espousing in the late 80s, 90s, 2000s were sort of a mix. On social issues, he was clearly more democratic, didn't really care about abortion or gay marriage. He expressed sort of tacit or disinterested or perfunctory support for the Iraq War, but it didn't seem like he really thought about it, and quickly pivoted, by 2004, which was on the earlier end, especially, in the sort of non-left wing sort of sphere, against the Iraq War. He sounds a lot like Ross Perot, who ran for president in 92 and 96. Also like Pat Buchanan, who founded our magazine, who ran in 92, 96, and 2000. These are ideas, a sort of nationalist approach that found purchase and resonance in both parties, but were not the mainstream of probably either party. And in a lot of ways, were probably more on the Democratic end, probably in the 90s or early 2000s, especially in the Bush administration. But although he has taken over the party clearly, he has not thoroughly combed the cadres of the party, nor is probably particularly interested. He's 80, not 50. And for all of his virtues, in-depth policy work, probably not top of the heap. Where that comes into, though, is it's always been this question since the George W. Bush project collapsed. Would any Republican administration just be sort of a redux of what the sort of Cheney wing wanted to do in the 2000s? So this is for all that the hell that George W. Bush deserves to pay, frankly. It is lost in the history of 05 to 09 that there were splits within the second Bush administration. Bush himself ended up siding more with Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State, against those who wanted to take a harder line on both Iran and then the Syrian government at the time under Assad. And that was the Cheney perspective. So Cheney's hegemony within the administration, within the country, was at its peak in 02, 03 when we invaded Iraq. It was at a nadir by the time they left office, and there's been mixed reporting, but I've even heard that the two men have basically spoken like twice in 15 years, which is astonishing for people who lived under the Bush-Cheney thing. The problem with not vivisecting and doing full-body surgery on the Republican Party for this administration, I think it may yet be coming under a future successor, is that there are a lot of people that will shift the gravity just sort of by by default towards a hard line on Iran. I mean, I remember some of these background calls that we would do with the first Trump administration, NSC, National Security Council background, and like you would think that the Iranians were the Third Reich and that we were London. Like it was the only thing that they were talking about. It was top of the order. It was a little bit redolent, frankly, of how Biden administration officials spoke about Ukraine, even if you think that's, even if you have sympathies for it, it's just sort of wildly out of context. I think to directly answer your question, Trump's pledge in 2024 was that he was going to end the wars. This language has been out there, but it was fastened and fine-tuned and driven home. The Republicans made gains with Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan, but also in other swing states like Pennsylvania. And they said, I think no one's going to hold Trump to the first 100 days thing or the first week thing or 24 hours thing. But I think it's pretty clear that if Trump does not disentangle from the Middle East war and the Ukraine war, that these are no longer Biden's wars. I mean, the person, Jamal, just said, it seems like it's already been forever. The reality is people are already forgetting Biden, right? I mean, and Biden kind of lost the full throttle of the presidency when he was kicked out of his own party last July. People are going to forget the genesis of these wars and just blame Trump. It's a little redolent of COVID itself, which COVID got blamed basically on the Democrats, even though the initial lockdowns were spearheaded by Republicans in 2020. I think the same thing will happen here. So I think the strategic case is self-evident. I don't think an Iran war is necessary or justified for U.S. national security, but I think it's almost more important to make the political argument, which is this is bad for Trump.
Thanks so much. And let's talk a little bit about opinion in Iran. Negar, hoping you can address this. In Washington, it often gets presented kind of in a black and white regime versus those against the regime. This is a nation of 90 million. I think opinion within the country is very complex and shifts over time. But we saw in 2015, when the JCPOA was struck, a lot of Iranians welcomed that. They went out into the street, kind of a party atmosphere. How has opinion changed over time? Are people hoping that negotiations between Trump and Iran will succeed? Are they rooting for war? What exactly do we know right now?
I think it's an important question, Ryan. Thank you. And we have not too much access to public opinion inside Iran. There's a gap in reporting. Data collection is not that easy. Opinion polls are on national security matters. Politics are not as easily conducted as here. And we also have too many interpreters of what Iranians want. And as you were saying, also simplifying the quote-unquote Iranian, whatever that means, a nation of 80+ million, many also in the diaspora. I will say that there are, unfortunately, outsized voices on the extreme ends of these opinions that don't necessarily represent what I would say that sort of big majority body in the middle. That's one of the problems. But overall, I would say where the society stands now, in the interest of time and to simplify myself here, is that the regime is dealing with a legitimacy crisis. That's pretty clear. I mean, you see the protests on the street, you see public opinion, talk to people. I would say generally, to generalize, Iranians are not happy with the status quo, with the governance, especially the state of the economy. But at the same time, that is a domestic issue, and the way I would connect that to our conversation, U.S.-Iran relations or tensions, is that the state of one of the reasons for that legitimacy crisis and their unhappiness with the way things are is the state of economy, which one of the main underlying reasons for the way it is are sanctions. So you see that sometimes misinterpreted as people or Iranians, quote unquote, not supporting diplomacy or sanctions relief. And that's not how I see it. One of the main grievances, I would say, that we see a big part of the population, especially the ones who protest the government or who are opposed or critical, is the way they're conducting their regional and foreign policy and these tensions with the US, which have led to years and years of sanction. Now, there's a lot of nuance in who people blame, and it's a big spectrum, all the way from purely blaming the United States for sanctions and purely blaming the government. But I would say what I see as majority or across the board is that I find very little Iranians who actually like sanctions, living under economic sanctions or the pressure sanctions, with the caveat that there is actually a small, very small elite who profit from the sanctions. There's even a term for it, kasaban tahrim, sanctions profiteers. But aside from that, looking at the population, the state of economy, and one of the main reasons for that, sanctions, is not something that anyone enjoys. As far as the view towards diplomacy and war, again, it's very hard, I would say, to find actual, organic support for war, for military strikes. Again, it's being interpreted in different ways that, okay, maybe if it's strategic strikes only on the nuclear facilities, it may not impact civilian infrastructure, which is not very accurate. But, you hear anecdotes here and there. I'm just addressing a lot of these things that we hear in the Western media and in analysis in the city. But overall, I would say there isn't an appetite for war. There is not much interest for sanctions or more sanctions. And so therefore, interpret that however you want. My interpretation is that diplomacy or the resolution of the current state is something people would support. Now, it may not always come as explicit because also a good part of the population doesn't want to sound or be perceived or seen as pro-regime. So if the regime is against sanctions, they don't want to be echoing that. But I would expect similar sentiments, as you mentioned, post-JCPOA, which meant sanctions relief, post the nuclear deal under the Obama era, if another round of successful negotiations happen. There's also, negotiation for the sake of negotiation. So there's very little trust. This is something that both is within the regime and also the population, that just starting negotiations doesn't necessarily mean an outcome, which seemed very unlikely during JCPOA talks. But I would expect to see similar sentiments sort of supporting a way out of the current state, which is certainly not popular in the country.
Thanks so much. Let's stay on sanctions because President Trump, I think I was surprised when he signed the maximum pressure memorandum and he said, I'm torn on doing this. I don't want it to be used that often. Another case where what Trump says doesn't necessarily totally line up with what's in that memorandum, but we've seen additional designations come out referencing the maximum pressure memorandum. So Jamal, I guess my question here is, Iran has been under serious sanctions since 2018 when Trump first pulled out of the JCPOA. How does this return to maximum pressure, if you can call it that? Is it likely to change Iran's calculus? Is there any more pressure that can really be added on a sanctions front?
I think the value of maximum pressure is actually for domestic audiences. We look at the sort of the recent trajectory. So on the campaign trail, I thought Donald Trump was extremely disciplined when it came to talking about Iran. To the point that it got weird. He would be given these openings to insult the supreme leader or be asked about these threats of assassination, and he would avoid getting into sort of chest beating or recriminations and sort of keep his powder dry. And I thought that was pretty notable. A pretty notable shift from the first term. since taking office, we've seen how he's sort of tried to balance these things. You know, we can debate how well he's doing that. I think the maximum pressure order was actually damaging to the prospect of direct negotiations with Iran. I think for the Iranian side, it made it very difficult within their domestic politics and within the sort of power structure to say, yes, we're going to go to the table with the return of these sanctions under threat from a position of weakness. And so I think that actually may have kept some of the pressure off of the President Trump, from sort of creating space so that he could pursue diplomacy. But you see that he's taking these actions. So he signs the maximum pressure order, but he says he doesn't want to do it. He talks about, if we, you know, I want a deal instead, but if we don't get a deal, there's going to be military repercussions. Then the next day he goes on Truth Social and says, whoa, the talk about military action is overblown. It's not happening anytime soon. Now he's sending bombers into the region, really significant buildup that, you know, looks like the type of buildup that you would engage in if you were going to go and do strikes on Iran. And I don't think that, you know, whether that is the intent or this is a signal, I think this actually makes it very difficult, again, for the Iranians to actually come to the table. And I think the lesson, you know, no president, aside from Obama, has managed to engage in direct negotiations with the Iranians over the nuclear program. Bush by choice, Trump because of the maximum pressure, because of some of the rhetoric, the Iranians refused to engage with him, which I think was a mistake, and I still think it is a mistake. And then Biden, the issue with Biden, I mean, there are many issues, but I think primarily it was one of a perception of political weakness of Biden, that if the Iranians signed on to a deal, the U.S. wouldn't be able to sustain it. Donald Trump would come back, he'd tear up the deal, Iran would be right back where it started. And the Biden team was unable to offer anything to address those concerns. And they look like pretty smart concerns now. Now that Trump is back, I think that there is this huge opportunity, but the more public negotiation that happens, public negotiation that often is not intended for the other side, it is intended for domestic audiences. I go back to the hearing yesterday, all of the preening and tough talk, and we're gonna bomb you guys. Khamenei is not watching a House Foreign Affairs committee, okay? This is good for your constituents, maybe for some of your donors, but all of this is not, it keeps us from the table. And it, you know, if this is how we go, you know, if President Trump is put in a position where he is leaning on the sticks and, you know, maximum pressure and sanctions only, I think it's going to be impossible to actually get the two sides to the table. And I think that goes for Iran as well. I mean, you know, we look back at, you know, the JCPOA. When the JCPOA actually went into effect, the Iranians had a military parade with ballistic missiles with nasty messages written on them, and the White House issued sanctions. So that was how they kicked off the era of restored, you know, restored relations. So anyway, so I think this is actually very damaging, and the faster the sides can actually get to the table, the less public negotiation that happens is really vital, because there is an opportunity here, a rare opportunity where you do have both sides wanting to find a deal. And I think, as Curt pointed out, I think the most important factor here is actually the domestic political constraints of the two parties, and navigating that is going to be what decides whether the parties actually come together and then can strike a deal.
Thanks so much. I want to broaden it out, and so any of you feel strongly like you want to answer, please hop in. But you know, we hear a lot of talk about the regional situation, and specifically kind of the dismantling of a large chunk of the axis of resistance's capabilities when it comes to their military ability to project strength and so forth. And so there are a lot of people saying, look at what happened to Hamas, look at what happened to Hezbollah, look at the fall of Assad, and saying, now's this golden opportunity to roll back Iran and really change the fundamental dynamics of the region. And, I think implicit in a lot of that, sometimes it's stated, is Iran is a paper tiger. They can't hit back. Why are we restraining ourselves? So is Iran a paper tiger? Is this, actually a moment where the U.S. can press the advantage and take military action and deal Iran a devastating blow, as the Hawks would suggest?
My answer to that would be no. So I think that's a pretty bad bet. But regardless, I think it's a moot question. Just to compare it to the major two wars the U.S. got involved in the last 25 years, Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly in the Iraqi scenario, it wasn't a problem of taking out the official government. So even if they were a paper tiger, it was holding the country and reforming it to be something better that didn't cost trillions of dollars and a bunch of wasted lives. That doesn't strike me at all as clear. I look at Iran and I see a combination of Iraq and Afghanistan. Population-wise, the mixture of urban and mountainous warfare that could potentially happen in any kind of insurgency just strikes me as a plain nightmare. And I do think that does occur to senior leadership in the White House, just not universal.
I agree, and I think the comparison is not even correct, comparing Iran to Hamas and Hezbollah. I would also add that this has been said about Hezbollah itself in the past. There have been times that the perception was that they're finished, and then they regrouped and came back. Same goes with Hamas. Secretary Blinken himself, I think, even said that they've been able to recruit even more in the course of the war. So yes, I think that if we look at the entirety of that alliance, the so-called axis of resistance, they took major hits. They also caused major hits. But as far as a comparison, I think it's not even correct. And I agree with Curt. A war with Iran, first of all, it won't be surgical. It can't remain surgical because they are prepared to respond, and they will respond. And actually, the rhetoric in Tehran, the talk is that if we get hit, we have to respond even harder. And that's how the perception is, that's how Trump would back off. And I don't know if that's a correct calculation, because sometimes it could also backfire. And again, as I said at the beginning, these things, you can't control the escalation once the fire starts. And yeah, it would be much worse than Iraq or Iraq and Afghanistan combined. How did that turn out?
I think we should go back. I think it's really clear that a lot of the advocates for this war view it as a U.S.-led regime change war, even if they won't come out and say that. That's the only formulation I've seen from them that actually makes sense. And I guess what I want to say about that is sort of to the sanctions issue. The U.S. has had crippling sanctions on Iran since 2010 under Obama. Has had a total embargo on Iran since the 1980s. He's coming up a lot in this briefing, but George W. Bush himself even said the United States has sanctioned itself out of influence inside of Iran. The sanctions and these military threats, I believe, have distorted the political economy inside of Iran and actually benefited the current ruling structure, have securitized the environment there, have hurt civil society and organic movements for representation and democracy and things like that, which is really none of our business. But what we can do is stop getting in the way of it. And the sanctions that block access to the internet and that block any sort of private industry inside of Iran and that isolate Iranians from the world, I think has kept Iran in this state of, this sort of revolutionary state that would not be sustainable were it not for outside influence. I think that, the Iranian people themselves have, made it clear numerous times their objections to the ruling government. And I think that if the U.S. really wants to do regime change needs to be organic. It's not something that outside powers can engage in because we've seen how that plays out. That is not something that the United States should sign up for. I don't think any Americans want to sign up for that. But change inside of Iran is possible if we take our foot off of the necks of Iranians. When the JCPOA was signed, it wasn't the reduction in the nuclear program that had Khamenei and hardliners inside of Iran worried. The number one thing that they warned about was the opening up of Iran to engagement with the West, the penetration of Iran by the West. This fear that the end of US and international imposed isolation would actually pose a greater threat to the repression inside of Iran than any external military threat or any sanctions could. And so anybody who wants to be tough on Iran for whatever reason, the toughest thing you can do is to actually let the Iranian people breathe and actually let the Iranian people behave in a way that currently is circumscribed by external factors as much as, almost as much as it is by internal factors.
I just want to add something to sort of tie it together. I think there's a dichotomy or very conflicting paths ahead. I see a very golden opportunity right now with President Trump. His, I think, very serious intent for diplomacy. He really seems to want a deal, not care too much about the contents of it, as long as they can have nuclear bombs, seems to be the only sort of framework which is acceptable by Tehran. They've time and again and recently reiterated they don't want nuclear weapons anyways, although again that may change as Ryan, you mentioned, but that's down the road. But also I think there's a very serious threat for basically going to war, and these couldn't be further apart, and that's sort of the irony of it. So this is a president, a Republican president, if you can even call him, who is very interested in a deal and I think is able to go and sell that to his base, to the Republican base who are traditionally against diplomacy with an adversary like Iran. He would be able to sell it as a good deal or the greatest deal, and the Democrats wouldn't resist as much as Republicans would. No Democratic president would be able to do something like that. That's why I call it a golden opportunity. And I'm not sure if the Iranians see that enough or understand how this, when it's a small window. But then at the same time, the threat of escalation in a war is a very serious. So we're looking at sort of these two paths that are really the opposite, and both of them are a possibility.
So I want to stick on the region, particularly because what's happening in Yemen seems to have at least some degree of connection to the U.S. posture toward Iran. So Curt, maybe you could start with this one. Why is Trump doing what Biden did and bombing the Houthis?
I think it's clearly at the urging of the government in Jerusalem. I think the relationship with the Israelis is a tango for Trump. I think he doesn't want the war to continue. I think the leader in Israel needs the war to continue for both his political and legal survival, in all likelihood. And so I think that's a tension. And I think, on the one hand, I think bombing the Houthis is pointless and hasn't changed anything in the 15 years or 10 years since they've been bombed by us, the Emiratis, the Saudis, Israelis in part. I think, that's the case against it. On the other hand, if you're looking at it sort of cynically, it's also the case of, well, nothing too bad has ever happened if we bombed the Houthis. So, that's the sort of case that it's a bone to our partners in Israel, and hopefully it'll get them off the White House's back. I think the calculations are pretty close to that for the Oval Office. Now, of course, for the National Security Advisor particularly, and other hawks within the administration, or potentially more agnostically hawkish people in the administration, people like Rubio or even Hegseth, again, I think it's seen as freedom of navigation, et cetera, which of course, kind of spilled out in the debate when this first happened last month, and then was crystallized by Vice President Vance's comments on it, which is like, actually not that much U.S. trade goes through Suez. It's a complete canard. The U.S. doesn't need it. It does, in fact, undermine U.S. messaging on European independence. But that's all sort of to the side. So I think that's what's going on. But again, a lot of this stuff is just open source. People assume that it's super secret or whatever. But the people who are most adamant and saber rattling on the Yemen mission clearly see it as a pretext to go after the quote head of the snake, the Iranians, and even Goldberg himself. I think he did the right thing in publishing it, frankly, as a journalist. But I don't agree with Jeffrey Goldberg's foreign policy, generally speaking. If you look at his record, and he went out of his way at the top of that piece to say, by the way, Yemen is sponsored by Iran, sponsored by Iran, sponsored by Iran. The Houthis are sponsored by Iran, and of course, the relationship is far more nebulous and complex than that.
And I think, kind of implicit in some of Trump's remarks about this issue is like a message to Iran to get the Houthis to stop. But that's not exactly how Iran, works with the axis of resistance and so forth, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very clear that the Houthis thought the Israelis had spiritually broken the ceasefire in early March. There had been incursions in the West Bank and mixed reporting on other stuff. The Israelis obviously broke the ceasefire a few weeks ago, and so that the cat's completely out of the bag. And the Houthis' justification, I think to its own people that it's rule over, is that it's the one militant group that hasn't, frankly, gotten rolled the last 15 months. I think the Hezbollah had an enormous setback. Hamas was decapitated, and I think it's quickly replenished its ranks in some ways. But the Houthis have, basically been fairly effective for their goals, and so they saw little risk in resuscitating that. But again, I think it's often very useful to just see what any party literally says why they're doing this, and the Houthis said they're doing it because of Israel. Full stop.
All right, we've got a couple more, time for a couple more questions, and I just kind of want to ask each one of our panelists here, essentially, let's say Trump and Iran gets to the negotiating table. Let's say there's a verified nuclear peace agreement. What are the expectations for this? What would a deal look like? How might it be different than the JCPOA, the way things are shaping up?
It's one of many million-dollar questions. I think it is interesting what President Trump's criticism of the original JCPOA, what it looks like. Initially, in 2015, he was the only major candidate, GOP candidate, who ruled out tearing up the deal. He actually made fun of the other candidates so they don't know what they're talking about. That's not how deals work. You can't just tear them up. He said he would enforce it harshly, but within the confines of the deal, proceed that way. And then after the political pressure and other factors, he says, okay, yeah, I am going to tear up the deal. And I think unlike the other people on the stage with him, he actually meant it. He said it because he actually believed, okay, if I say this, I'm going to do it. And that's what he did. But his main criticism of it was, there were sort of the typical things. It's not permanent, which, I mean, what is permanent? What agreements are permanent? But his main criticism was actually that the United States, unlike the other parties to the agreement, could not benefit from it economically. And that is not because of the deal itself or anything on the Iranian side. That is actually a decision by the United States that we have a trade embargo against Iran. The deal had very limited carve-outs for Boeing to sell planes and aviation parts to Iran. But beyond that, there is no trade relationship. And I really, I think a lot about the failure of the JCPOA, the political failure of the JCPOA. This is a deal that went through on a very partisan basis and could not be sustained once the White House switched parties. And I think one of the reasons for that was, as bold as the notion of negotiating with Iran was at the time, I don't think the Obama administration was willing to go as far as was needed in terms of lifting sanctions in exchange for whatever Iranian concessions there needed to be, but creating those constituencies that could sustain an agreement above the political attacks that any agreement would have. And so I think if there is a Trump deal, I think it is likely going to be one that does acknowledge, a peaceful nuclear program inside of Iran and has the verification in place to do that, and then would create some of that political protection for an agreement by potentially enabling greater engagement between the U.S. and Iran in terms of trade and other forms of engagement to be able to sustain that agreement. And that then could make that deal, the beginning of further engagement and talks rather than a one-off and then the parties go back to attacking one another and parties switch and then the deal's dead.
Just to add quickly to how to get there, I think there needs to be sort of some goodwill or trust building measures. And there's a lot that can be done even before sanctions relief, as far as looking at Iran's blocked assets. The US has a lot of leverage. So there was about $6 billion blocked in South Korea on behalf of the US, which was released under the Biden administration, went into Qatar. Iranians have not been able to touch it. That could be something to look at. Iraq buys energy from Iran. They haven't been able to pay because of US pressure. That's about $10, $12 billion. Japan, same situation. So even before getting to sanctions relief, there are very easy sort of one-off steps that the administration can take as far as building trust or showing sort of this goodwill to then get to where that point is. And honestly, I don't think President Trump cares too much about the details of the deal. So it doesn't have to look too different from JCPOA as far as the technicalities, but it just has to be presented and packaged as a better deal.
I don't have that much to add about it. I mean, I would say, JCPOA was done in tandem with the Europeans. That feels further off. I don't think Trump has ever liked these vast constellations of multilateral agreements, whether it be trade or foreign policy. Trump's movement in general doesn't like regional blocs, right? I mean, I don't know how real in-depth his opinion is about the European Union, but obviously a lot of people in his milieu, Farage, Bannon, people like that, very negative on it. So I think one point of distinction will be that even if it's especially if it's an informal arrangement, it will be unilateral with the U.S. And of course, the Europeans are in compliance with the original deal, more or less. So the reason to do it, not as much there, but obviously European relations with the U.S. Are in winter at the moment, at least on the Ukraine issue.
I think also adding to that, I mean, the region is different, and the 2015 deal was opposed by the GCC states.
I actually think that's like a very crucial. I mean, so the driving. I've talked a lot about Israel in this session, but the driving force within the administration on a lot of its Middle East policy was UAE and Saudi. Obviously, the sort of opera bouffe peak of this was the attempted sacking of the Qatari government in summer of 2017 of the blockade. But the vibe was very much that it was particularly Saudi MBS led, a lot of the early Iran hawkishness, not as much the Israelis. That's different now. And although Trump and his family are enmeshed with both the Israelis and the Gulf states, they're pretty enmeshed with the Gulf states and a more pragmatic MBS. And I think MBZ has always been pragmatic. I think is a major switch up in the dynamic that we had 8 years ago. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I mean that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, the Saudis, have a deal with Iran, a brokered normalization with Iran. The UAE is delivering messages. So I think that really changes things where you actually have parties who oppose the deal who are now far more interested in stability and looking at future economic interdependence and things like that. You don't have that with the Netanyahu government in Israel. So that spoiler still exists, and I do think that we have to ask the question, will Netanyahu allow Trump to have a deal with Iran? Under the Biden administration, Netanyahu and various ministers said we're not. We don't have to abide by any agreement the United States strikes with Iran. And the signal there was the sabotage efforts, the assassinations within the country, that those would continue, and the United States, on top of not being able to say to Iran, this deal will actually uphold the deal this time, could not say we can actually restrain our partners in the region from defying the deal and from playing spoiler. And so I think the rubber, there's going to be a confrontation there potentially if there is an agreement, at least a political confrontation, and we'll see how that goes.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us, and please give a round of applause to the panel. Thanks.